France did not collapse because it was weak. That is the lie, repeated to make the ending feel inevitable. When people imagine the fall of the French monarchy, they pictured chaos, starving peasants, reckless spending, an out-of-touch court drowning in excess. They imagined decay before disaster. But decay was not the problem. France collapsed at the height of its power. In the late 18th century, France was not a failing state. It was Europe's most populous kingdom. Its army dominated the continent. Its culture set standards others followed. Its monarchy was old, legitimized, feared. No foreign army stood at its gates. No rival empire occupied its capital. No revolution had yet been imagined. France looked stable. That stability was expensive. Power at scale always is. France maintained the largest standing army in Europe. It financed fortresses, fleets, diplomacy, and global ambition. It projected influence across borders, not because it needed to, but because it could. And when Britain emerged as its primary rival, France did not retreat. It doubled down. The rivalry with Britain was not ideological. It was systemic. Whoever controlled trade routes, colonies, and credit would shape the future balance of power. France understood this. So when Britain became entangled in rebellion across the Atlantic, France saw opportunity, not to liberate colonies, not to spread ideals, but to weaken its rival. The American Revolution was not France's war, but it was France's investment. Ships were built, armies were supplied, loans were extended. France financed the rebellion not because it expected profit, but because it expected advantage. And it worked. Britain lost prestige, Britain lost territory, Britain bled, France won. That victory is where the story usually ends in textbooks. But victory did not pay interest. The war added an enormous burden to an already strained treasury. The crown had not raised taxes proportionally for decades. Its fiscal structure was rigid, unequal, and politically protected. The nobility and clergy contributed little. The tax base was narrow. Collection was inefficient. Reform was possible but dangerous. So the crown did what powerful states often do when reform threatened stability. It was borrowed. At first, borrowing felt harmless. Credit was abundant. Lenders were confident. France had never defaulted. Its reputation was strong. Debt did not feel like weakness. It felt like continuity. The crown issued bonds, rolled over obligations, deferred hard decisions. Each loan postponed conflict with entrenched elites. Each loan bought time, and time, it was assumed, would solve the problem. But debt does not buy time forever. It only rearranges it. As interest payments grew, they consumed more of the state's revenue, not gradually, structurally. A rising share of the budget went not to defense, not to governance, not to public order, but to servicing obligations already incurred. This was not hidden, but it was normalized. Debt became a permanent feature of governance. Ministers came and went, each proposing reforms, each blocked by resistance, each forced back to the same solution: more credit. And credit, once embedded, begins to dictate behavior. Lenders do not care about ideology. They care about repayment. They care about credibility. They care about predictability. So the monarchy's decisions slowly shifted. Policies were no longer judged by necessity alone, but by how they would be received by creditors. Reform was framed not as justice, but as reassurance. Spending was evaluated not for effectiveness, but for market confidence. The crown still ruled, but it no longer acted freely. This is where the illusion deepened. France was still winning diplomatically, still dominant militarily, still admired culturally. Nothing looked broken. But internally, the system was tightening. Every year, without reform, increases reliance on borrowing. Every loan increased sensitivity to interest rates. Every delay made future reform more painful. This was not incompetence. It was rational behavior inside a trapped system. Confronting the nobility risked internal fracture. Raising taxes risked unrest. Cutting spending risked power projection. Borrowing risked none of those things immediately. So borrowing became policy. Then something subtle changed. Creditors began to ask questions. Not moral questions, technical ones. How sustainable was the revenue base? How reliable were tax collections? How credible were reform promises? Confidence did not vanish, but it narrowed. Interest rates crept upward. New loans required better justification. Ministers were pressured to demonstrate fiscal seriousness. This is when the monarchy made its most consequential mistake. It accepted the logic. Instead of challenging the structure that made debt unavoidable, the crown accepted the premise that credibility must be earned through reform without changing who bore the cost. That meant austerity at the edges, administrative tweaks, symbolic gestures, enough to signal effort, not enough to solve the problem. Debt continued to grow, and with it, dependence. By the late 1780s, interest payments dominated the budget. The crown was not insolvent, but it was constrained. Every major decision had fiscal consequences. Every fiscal decision had political risk. France had become a state managing its creditors. Not openly, not officially, but functionally. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They imagine the monarchy collapsing under pressure from below. But pressure came first from above, from the architecture of credit itself. The system did not demand revolution. It demanded reassurance, and reassurance required legitimacy. The crown needed consent not from the people, but from those whose capital sustained the state. That is why, when traditional mechanisms failed, the monarchy reached for a solution that had not been used in generations. It is called the Estates General. This was not a concession to democracy, it was a financing decision. The crown needed authorization to reform taxation. It needed political backing to restore confidence. It needed legitimacy to stabilize borrowing. The Estates General was supposed to solve a fiscal problem. That was the assumption. What followed was not planned, not anticipated, not controlled, but by the time the assembly met, the monarchy's authority was already compromised. Not because it was hated, but because it was financially exposed. Once a state needs permission to function, sovereignty becomes negotiable. France did not collapse at this moment. It still had an army, it still had institutions, and it still had force. But force without funding is temporary, not with revolution, not with collapse, but with a monarchy that still appears intact, yet can no longer act without asking. The mistake was not the war, it was not the debt alone. It was believing that credit could replace power without changing who ultimately controlled it. That belief will be tested next, because once a state asks for permission to function, it rarely gets to choose who answers. When the Estates General convened in 1789, it was not called to rewrite France. It was called to reassure creditors, to restore confidence that the crown could still manage its obligations. This was supposed to be procedural. Instead, it exposed something the system could no longer hide. The monarchy did not control the room. Representation became the immediate battleground. Voting structures, legal authority, legitimacy questions that had been dormant for generations suddenly mattered again. Not because ideology had awakened overnight, but because the financial system demanded clarity. Credit does not tolerate ambiguity. Who has the authority to tax? Who guarantees repayment? Who speaks for the state? These questions were no longer theoretical. They were financial. As debates dragged on, markets watched, confidence thinned, borrowing costs rose again. The crown's position weakened by the week. The irony was brutal. The very institution called to save the monarchy was dismantling it in real time, but still nothing collapsed. This is where popular history rushes ahead, skipping the most important part, because revolutions are not spontaneous explosions. They are delayed reactions. The monarchy still commanded troops, it still issued orders, it still projected authority. But behind every command was a question that could no longer be ignored. Can this be funded? And when funding becomes uncertain, obedience becomes conditional. That is when power starts to leak. The state attempted compromise. Concessions were offered, symbolic gestures made. The goal was not transformation, but stabilization. But stabilization requires trust, and trust, once lost, does not return on command. As political debate intensified, capital became cautious. Lenders hesitated. Refinancing became harder. The crown was forced to make decisions faster, with fewer options. Every path forward carried risk. Raise taxes too aggressively and unrest spreads. Delay reform and credit evaporates. Use force and legitimacy collapses entirely. This was the trap closing. And then something critical happened. Authority fractured. Not because the people seized it, but because the system stopped recognizing a single center of control. Assemblies claimed legitimacy. Crowds followed. Orders conflicted. Enforcement hesitated. And when enforcement hesitates, systems recalibrate. Money does not wait for clarity. It moves toward safety. Confidence drained from royal guarantees. State paper lost value. The government struggled to meet obligations, not because resources vanished, but because trust had. This is where the revolution becomes unavoidable. Not as ideology, but as logistics. A state that cannot reliably pay, cannot reliably command. Soldiers still exist, but loyalty wavers when wages lag. Bureaucrats still work, but compliance fades when authority feels temporary. The monarchy's greatest mistake was believing this was a political crisis. It was not. It was a balance sheet crisis. To solve it, the revolutionaries did what desperate systems always do. They restructured. Church lands were seized, not for vengeance, but for liquidity. New currency was issued not for ideology, but for cash flow. Debt was reorganized, not for justice, but for survival. Each move was framed as liberation. Each move was financial, and each move accelerated collapse. Because restructuring without credibility is just default in slow motion. Inflation surged, confidence eroded further. The capital fled. The new system inherited the old obligations without the old authority. This is the moment where many narratives blame chaos. But chaos was not the cause, it was the consequence. Once the monarchy lost financial credibility, everything downstream became unstable. Laws changed faster than systems could absorb. The authorities rotated too quickly to settle. Every faction promised solutions. None could restore trust, and trust is the real currency of states. Without it, paper means nothing. Decrees mean nothing. Titles mean nothing. The king, once absolute, became irrelevant. Not executed yet. Not abolished yet. Just unfunded. That is the quiet death of authority. When obedience becomes optional, power is already gone. Eventually, violence followed. It always does when systems fail to resolve pressure peacefully. But violence was not the mechanism of collapse. It was the residue. The monarchy did not die at the guillotine. It died earlier when credit stopped working. The $50 billion mistake was not a single loan. It was not even the American War itself. It was the belief that borrowing could preserve power without changing who ultimately controlled it. France financed victory abroad by mortgaging stability at home. It postponed reform through credit until reform became impossible without destroying legitimacy. And when the system finally demanded adjustment, it was too late to manage it quietly. This is the pattern history repeats. Empires do not fall because people rise up. People rise up because systems fail silently first. Debt is not dangerous because it is immoral. It is dangerous because it shifts decision-making away from sovereignty and toward credibility. Once a state governs to satisfy its balance sheet rather than its structure, authority becomes conditional, and conditional authority never survives crises. That is the lesson hidden beneath the French Revolution. Not bread, not slogans, not ideology, but accounting. The French monarchy was not overthrown, it was liquidated, and liquidation does not look dramatic until the very end. This is why the story matters now.